Throughout the research and planning section, I had many skills that I needed to develop in order to complete it successfully. Firstly, I had to plan my time effectively, and I did this using Google Calendar. This was helpful because the appointments and deadlines I put in my online calendar would sync with my phone to remind me of deadlines that I needed to work to complete work on time. Furthermore, I had to find, interpret, and analyse real magazines which gave me inspiration for my final piece. To do this, I used Prezi to analyse music magazines, and this was effective because I could start work at school and then finish it when I got home. After research and planning, my skills had been developed and they aided my work because I was more prepared and knew what I needed to include in my final product when it came to construction. During research and planning, I had to also take my photos for my real magazine. Whilst doing this, I had to use a professional DSLR camera with efficient lighting conditions, and I had to take photos that looked as professional as possible. I had to do 3 photo shoots in total, and throughout doing this, I learned how to use a camera, how to take photos, and how to use accessories for the camera, such as a tripod, effectively. When in the school studio, I also had to apply different lights to my photography vinyl to take photos effectively with different coloured effects in the background to get a good front cover style picture. After realising what conventions of a magazine are effective from the research and planning section, the work I finally produced looked far more professional than my preliminary task. This was because I had noticed how to lay out my work in a professional way without my work looking like a poster or any other kind of magazine, such as a fashion magazine. My contents page of my final magazine looks far more professional as I had included graphic features, text with different effects, and I had added more body text to give information about the features and stories within the magazine. Furthermore, I use an editor's note in the body font style, which is another convention that I found to be stereotypical in professional magazines such as Q and Mixmag. On my front cover, I used conventions such as a bold, clear masthead and a house colour to establish a style and theme which would be carried out throughout my magazine. I made this masthead clear so that it would attract my audience, and I made the house colour a bright blue as it looked effective and bright, and it was a connotation of the indie genre. Furthermore, on the front cover, I used plugs to advertise what was inside, such as the March Festival news sticker and the Playing Reading was the best experience of my life cover lines. On the double page spread, I used conventions from other magazines like carrying the B logo forward from the front cover, which is stereotypical from Q magazine, to the double page spread. I did this because I think that it looked effective and it would establish familiarity throughout the magazine, and it was also a way to point out to the audience that this was an exclusive interview for the magazine. After completing my preliminary task, my work was more organised and structured from the beginning because I knew how long it took me to put my preliminary task together. I feel that overall my work was well planned as I had paper plans in my research and planning, and this helped when making my magazine as I already had a basic idea of how to lay it all out. Like I mentioned earlier, I used Google Calendar to add times and dates to when work needed to be completed and when certain deadlines were so that I knew to stick to time. Once I had these reminders set, I tried to complete my work in these time limits to allow myself to go back over and make any necessary corrections. If I hadn't completed my preliminary task, then I wouldn't have known how long it would have taken to make a magazine using Photoshop. Therefore, it made it clear to me how long it would take to get an effective product using the software available. I planned a draft for my front cover, contents page and double page spread and then developed those drafts further. I had made decisions on what my house colour was going to be and how I wanted every page to be laid out. This was a long process of redrafting, but overall it meant that I had a well-developed product by the time it was finished. This well-developed product also had a clear thought process that had been implemented to get it finished on time. After research and planning, I had also learned how to use software and hardware properly to create a successful product. This knowledge would come in particularly helpful during construction as time could be saved when working my way around Photoshop. In my preliminary task, the photo of the front cover was taken as a long shot, which showed the model stood before a brick wall. This photo's composition wasn't bad as I had space around her to write, but because the image had been shot in front of a brick wall, all of my text had to be placed in coloured blocks, which is where my front cover of my preliminary task lacked the professional look. On my real front cover, however, I took the photo as a mid-shot, which is a decision I made as I wanted to show the model's costume and facial expression in more detail to the reader. I also used a mode of address in my final front cover as my model is looking directly at the camera. This made up the majority of my image, therefore I would say that my photo for my real magazine had been planned more and was much better composed than my preliminary task photo. Because the graphic feature of the artist Luna on the contents page is from the same photo shoot as the front cover, the lighting remained the same, but the pose had changed as I had opted for a long shot to compose the image. I chose this shot because it then showed off my model completely, and this made a good graphic feature to draw the reader into the main story on the contents page. The other graphic feature that I used on my contents page of Chloe was taken from a high angle, and the model made up the lower half of the photo, and the top half was mainly wildlife and trees. I decided to do this as being outdoors in nature is stereotypical of the indie genre, so composing the image of wildlife too benefited the outcome when placed on my contents page. On my double page spread, I used another long shot of my model as I thought that this page was giving the most information about the artist, so a whole body shot was required to show just exactly who the artist is so that the audience can really understand my choice of costume. Page layout and design when in construction changed all the time on the front cover in particular. Initially, I started off with a red colour scheme, the same sort of red shown in my school magazine. After trying to implement some text boxes on my front cover with my model in the centre, it was clear that the colour scheme didn't look right on the page with the colours of my model's costume. Therefore, I decided to experiment and change the colour scheme a couple of times, firstly to a dark blue and then to a light blue, which turned out to be the final choice of house colour. I wanted to include skylines on my front cover above the masthead, as this was a bold block of bright colour which would outline what is in the issue of this magazine without too much reading from the audience. This differs from my school magazine, as this was a convention that I didn't know existed at the time of creating my preliminary task. Furthermore, the use of transparency for plugs on my front cover added to the design, as the colour text boxes needed to be noticed by the reader, but I didn't want them to completely dominate the page. Therefore, by making them slightly transparent, they are there to see clearly, but they do not take chunks out of my central image. When constructing my magazine, I used the documents I created in research and planning closely to make sure I was sticking to the plan that I had created. I used Keynote in my research and planning to make a presentation about particular font choices that I had made, and the main fonts used in my final products were Big John and Slim Joe, two fonts from the same family, and Fake Smiths, which was used as my masthead, with Source Sans Pro as my body text font. I decided to use Big John and Slim Joe as contrasting fonts throughout my magazine because one font worked well as a heading and the other worked well as a subheading. Therefore, there was an element of familiarity between the fonts. I used Fake Smiths as my masthead font, as each character had an individual personality, and this worked well with the indie genre, and I decided to use Source Sans Pro as my body text font, as this looked professional and was one of the sans serif typeface, which made the magazine look modern. Fonts used in my preliminary task, however, were limited to two pre-installed ones, which were Stencil and Cracked. These fonts were used in my preliminary task as they were edgy and were already available to me when I started laying things out. This differs from my real magazine because when I started to look at fonts in research and planning, I had to look for new fonts which suited the style of my magazine online, and then I downloaded the ones I liked to create my own style. Also, I used the paragraph and character menus in Photoshop to alter the characteristics of individual words, characters, and paragraphs of text throughout my magazine to make sure that text fitted in spaces on the page. Again, this was another feature which I wasn't aware about when constructing my school magazine, so my real magazine looks more professional. Finally, the content of my music magazine differed completely to the content of my preliminary task, as I had put a lot more thought into what stories would be featured in my final piece. I put more thought in because everything that I made in my music magazine had to appeal to my target audience, so the stories had to be designed around them. In my preliminary task, I didn't have a target audience in mind and therefore made up the stories myself without putting much more thought in. The majority of the features on the contents page of my school magazine would have been general informative articles which wouldn't have conveyed an opinion or any interest to the audience. However, in my final piece, I created articles such as album reviews and interviews with artists such as Luna discussing the first 100 days of her career. I also included Q&A sessions with specific artists to give some human interactive elements to the features of the magazine. This made the content of my final magazine more interesting than those featured in my school magazine, as I had to put time into thinking of the features before writing them in, whereas with my school magazine, as soon as I had thought of an idea, they were written down and left.